So on February 24th, 2022, the world watched as Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. It was a move that absolutely stunned so many people. But here's the thing, this wasn't some sudden out-of-the-blue decision. To really get what happened, we've got to look past the breaking news and start to unravel the really complex logic that had been building up for years. For years, a lot of analysts in the West saw Vladimir Putin as a cold, calculating guy, a rational realist, someone who played the game of geopolitics without a lot of emotion or ideology. So when he launched what looked like a super risky, maybe even reckless war, it caught a lot of people completely flat-footed. It just didn't seem to fit the image. And that raises the big question we're going to dig into today. What was the thinking that led to this moment? Okay, so our first clue is what you might call the geopolitical story. This is the official narrative, the one Russia presented to the world. It's a story all about self-defense, arguing that, hey, our actions were a totally necessary response to a direct threat that was building up right on our borders. And at the absolute heart of that argument is one long-standing complaint: NATO expansion. From Moscow's point of view, the alliance wasn't just getting bigger, it was deliberately creeping closer and closer, putting military gear right on Russia's doorstep. Putin argued again and again that this wasn't just some unfriendly gesture, it was an existential threat, and that promises made in the past not to expand had been broken, leaving Russia feeling like its security was being totally ignored. This timeline really shows you what Russia saw as these 5 waves of eastward expansion. It kicks off in 1999, but it's that 2004 wave that brings NATO right up to Russia's border. But the real tipping point, the moment that set off all the alarms in Moscow, was 2008. That's when NATO officially promised that one day Ukraine and Georgia would become members. After that, you see military cooperation just ramp up, with the U.S. selling serious weapons, and then, in 2021, signing a new strategic partnership. So, from Moscow's perspective, this didn't look like an alliance just growing. It looked like a hostile military base was being set up right on its front porch. And look, while that geopolitical argument was very real, they repeated it constantly, a lot of researchers believe it's only half the story. To really, truly understand the decision to invade, we need to peel back another layer. We have to look at a second, much deeper motivation. And this brings us to our second clue. This is where we see Putin not just as a geopolitical strategist, but as a kind of historian-in-chief. This part of the story isn't about missile ranges or military alliances. It's about a deeply personal nationalist belief about the very existence of Ukraine itself. This quote right here gets to the absolute heart of it. In July 2021, just a few months before the invasion, Putin published this enormous, nearly 7,000-word essay. And this wasn't your standard political speech. No, this was a massive historical argument with one single powerful point that Ukrainians and Russians are, fundamentally, one people who are artificially split apart by history. His version of history is pretty detailed. He claims modern Ukraine was basically an artificial invention of the Bolsheviks, who he says just gave away historically Russian land. He dismisses the Ukrainian language as just a regional dialect of Russian. And in the end, his bottom line is this: Ukraine can only have true sovereignty, real independence, if it's in partnership with Russia. So you see, this isn't a geopolitical argument anymore. It's a flat-out rejection of Ukraine's right to exist as a separate, independent nation. Okay, so that's the historical case that Putin lays out. But the question is, how does this personal interpretation of history actually stack up against, the academic record? Let's take a look. When you put Putin's claims side by side with what most historians say, some pretty big disagreements pop up. His claim that the borders were drawn without any thought to who lived there, well, that's contradicted by the Soviets' own census back in 1926, which showed clear ethnic Ukrainian majorities. The argument about the language, it kind of ignores centuries of separate linguistic development. And the idea that Ukraine never had real statehood, that overlooks groups like the Cossack Hetmanate, which was a self-governing state that existed for over 100 years. And just look at this map. This is really key. This isn't some Western creation. This is from the official 1926 Soviet census. See the darker shades? That shows a higher percentage of ethnic Ukrainians. And look where they are. Even in the east and the south, the very lands Putin called historically Russian, the population was overwhelmingly Ukrainian. So the Kremlin's own historical data contradicts the very narrative being used to justify the invasion. So now we've got these two powerful ideas running at the same time. On one side, there's the geopolitical fear of NATO. On the other, this deep historical belief that Ukraine isn't even a real country. So the final question is, How did these two threads get twisted together to finally trigger the decision for a full-scale invasion?
The key idea to understand here is something called preventative war. Now, this isn't a war you fight because you're being attacked right now. It's a war you start to prevent a future threat from becoming so big you can't handle it. It's all driven by this belief that if you wait, things will only get worse, which creates this powerful now or never feeling.
And this is where it all snaps together. For Putin, those two stories, the geopolitical one and the historical one, they fused into one single intolerable idea. The West wasn't just building a military threat near Russia. In his mind, it was building an anti-Russia, as he called it, on land that he considered historically Russian land. This completely transformed a regular geopolitical problem into a massive civilizational threat that was happening, in his view, on his own turf.
So you can see this three-step logic that started to take shape. Step 1, the geopolitical fear of a future Ukraine armed to the teeth by NATO. That's an unacceptable threat. Step 2, the historical mission, the belief that this is all happening on Russian land to Russian people. And that leads to step 3, the tipping point, that urgent now or never feeling that you have to act before Ukraine gets too strong to control. The invasion then was presented not as a choice, but as a forced measure. This quote from the very speech announcing the invasion is just incredibly revealing. By comparing the situation to the Soviet Union getting caught off guard by the Nazi invasion in 1941, Putin was framing his preventative war in the most dramatic, apocalyptic terms you can imagine. He was essentially arguing that waiting would be a historic, catastrophic mistake, one that he had no right to repeat.
And that leaves us with a final and pretty unsettling question. The rationale for this war rests so heavily on one leader's specific interpretation of history. So, if someone believes they have the right to gather lands they think are historically theirs, it raises a profound and frankly dangerous question for the whole world. Where exactly do those historic lands end?